Welcome to Art with Ian. Today we're talking about how 3D forms, learning 3D forms and understanding them will lead to being able to do complex form design with lighting setups in your artwork. So basically what we want to do is we want to take the idea of these 3D forms, but basic 3D forms, and turn them into things like these kinds of paintings. So first thing we want to do is talk about some of the basics of these forms and what we have going on here with that. So when you choose a light, let's talk first about choosing light, because really the reason we see in 3 dimensions is because of light. It's the reason we see it all, right? So when you choose a light setup, you're looking for a 1, 2, 3. You want a 1, 2, 3 read on anything that will offer that to you, like a cubic form in this case. So basic, and also consider that if the light is completely top down, like this basically, then any kind of cast shadow is going to live completely underneath the subject. So let's say, for example, if you've got a character and you want them to kind of have like this really, bathed in this, kind of glorious light kind of a feel, then that might work really well because you've got the nose, you've got all of these forms that are pushing straight out over the face that will cast shadows. But maybe for something like this setup to show these shapes, a completely top-down light would have left basically no cast shadow for the objects, and that would be kind of boring looking. So choosing light based on the subject, looking for the 1, 2, 3 read for clarity, and also making sure that whatever the forms on that subject are best described by the light you choose, especially for the mood you want to set up. Let's look at the actual light that I'm using here. I'm using like a sunlight emulation, which means that we have parallel light, right? Because the sun comes down to the earth in parallel. So that means that fall off isn't the same as if we took like one candle or one light bulb and like a local light, like a candle or whatever. Then you're gonna have like radial fall off basically, right? And so with light hitting a surface, we have to start considering how it behaves. So what does it do? It bounces. Light hits the surface and it bounces. Now if this was a perfectly reflective surface, which it's not, we know it's not because we can't see reflections of the objects on it, then that light would literally bounce one direction perfectly, because there would be no disturbance on the surface to basically throw that bouncing light in more than one direction. However, because we know it's not a perfect reflective surface, it's actually diffused bounce light, which means that it's bouncing in all directions, more like this, right? Knowing that totally changes the way we think about what that light is doing to the objects around it. So let's look at, for example, right here. This right here. Now, if you think about the light coming down and bouncing only in one direction, would you ever put bounce light underneath this area of this cylinder? No, you just wouldn't, because you'd think, oh, the light's coming down this way, hitting here, bouncing off that way, and that's the end of its story. But it's not just doing that. It's diffused bounce and it's bouncing back up at the cylinder. So it's really important to understand these kinds of basic things and that's why we use just basic forms before we dig into major subjects like human bodies and things like that, because this is the easiest way to actually to start describing the phenomenon that is light and all of this stuff. So basically, I'm just going to leave this here for you to read, but most objects exhibit diffuse reflection, which, basically everything I was just talking about. So there's that. I highly recommend maybe taking a note of this, or just certainly make a mental note of it, because it's really important for understanding how light is scattering around and behaving off of surfaces. Now, if you wanted to think about the way that I set up this light is coming down from the right, pretty much just straight down from the right. And so a normal 2D arrow kind of helps us to see that. Okay, but what if the light was coming down from over my shoulder? What if the light was coming down from in front of me, and I wanted arrows to help me feel that three-dimensional space of the light itself in 3D? What you can do, I should leave that on. I'll leave that on for people to read if they want. Now, let's zoom in a little bit here and look at this. Do you see what's happening here? Right there, that, more specifically this right here. That is telling us that we see how much of the arrow we see in 3D space. So it helps us to understand the actual direction of light. It's not just coming down at the angle we see, but it's also coming down, going away from us, right? It's pointing away from us. So then I could say, oh, this light is coming down over my right-hand shoulder. And I can see that because of the actual 3D nature of the arrow itself, which is basically just using a cone. So now let's see how these, I'm going to go ahead and shut this off. So hopefully everyone's read that if they wanted to. So let's say we wanted to understand how, this is something that took me a long time to truly really grasp myself. So hopefully this video will help you out. Let's say we want to now translate these shapes into our actual subject. Well, I always struggled to see, well, how is that a thing? It's not like we draw our characters out of spheres and rectangles and cylinders. It's the way they're rendered that we need to understand. We need to understand that basically, if there's a core shadow on something spherical, and then we have a spherical part of our character, we need to know how to render spheres, right? So let's look at this diagram real quick, and then we'll get into actually looking at the illustration and how that relates. So passive light, okay, passive highlight, let's start with that right here. Passive highlight. So that is basically where the light's actually hitting the object. And then the active highlight is our eye to the object. And so that's something really important to realize, to understand. When you see this bright hot spot on something, that's not where the light is hitting the object necessarily. More, it's actually your perception of the light hitting the object. Okay, and then bounce light, we talked about bounce light. That's why the underside of this is being lit, and that's why it's being lit white, because we have a white surface bouncing up into the object. Then we have an occlusion shadow. An occlusion shadow is basically where light is just not getting in. It can't get in anymore. And so and what happens, the reason for that is because you've got two objects so close together, they're blocking the light. And in this case, it's the sphere, which is actually coming out in all directions. The bottom of that sphere, as it tucks in, the point where the sphere actually touches the surface is not a very large one. And so then you've got a bunch of surface of the sphere over the top of the surface it's sitting on, where there's a little space as it kind of comes around, and that's where the occlusion shadow comes from. Next you have a cast shadow. The cast shadow is determined by the object and the direction of light itself. So if you think about, for example, this right here, this edge coming down into here, That's our direction of light, basically. So think about that. We have halftone. Halftone is basically where the light fall off is basically meeting the terminator. Which I'll just jump to terminator and then we'll talk about the core shadow. So the terminator is basically where light is literally no longer hitting the object. Like light does not, if you took all of the gradation and everything out of this, all of the shape, all of the feathering, that would just be a hard edge right there. That's the terminator. Light does not hit this part of the surface any longer. It has turned fully away from the light. And then core shadow. The core shadow is the part of the shadow where ambient, reflected, bounce, any other kind of light around the room does not get into the shadow. So you're inside the terminator and you're not on the half tone going back into light, and you're not in the half tones going into reflected or ambient light. So those are basically the things to be considering, like when you're rendering. The reason I chose a sphere is because it's probably the most sophisticated of all of the shapes as far as the things you have to be considering when you're working on it. So now let's get into our example here. So let's look at this leg. So this leg right here, if we thought about that in the most simple, without any secondary shapes or anything else on it, we have basically a rectangle, but I added one little triangulation right here, like just a little angle to show the knee is facing up and out. So we've got the knee, which is catching light from up here. We've got the front of the leg where the shin is, which is turned away from the firelight, which is out there, and then turning slightly into the light that is at his scepter orb thing, right? So those are the 3 points of light that are being used in this painting. Well, and this. So we've got 2 local lights, this one and this one. We've got a firelight off the camera, which is coming in like this. And then we've got skylight, which is ambient light, and that's coming in all around the character, like this, okay, from the top. So let's look at another one of these simplified shapes that is making up the basic lighting structure or system, so that I can, as I worked on this, so I could understand what's getting what light. Let's look at the torso. Cylinder, it's basically a cylinder. So we've got, if you were to cut him, off and just look at him, cut his body right here where I have, you would see up in the light would hit the bottom side. You've got this ambient light coming in, and then you've got, remember this core shadow, right, from what we were just talking about, and then you've got your main highlight, which is coming from the firelight. Okay, so basically the torso on this guy is rendered with that exact, and then you have abs, which is just a small subset of kind of the same idea. But yeah, so you see the core shadow, you've got bounce light, or this is actually not bounce light, this is just coming from a local light that is the scepter, and it's also hitting here and here along there. Then you've got another local light hitting here, and that's changing, but then outside of that you've got the firelight coming in, and you've got the ambient light coming in. Oh, excuse me, that didn't quite go where I wanted. Ambient light coming in here just to rim light him, right? And this is very exaggerated rendering. This is the kind of rendering that you would use, you want things to pop. Like, this is not hyperrealism, this is graphic. So, pushing these elements harder than maybe in real life they would be, for the sake of a visual statement, basically. Okay, let's look at the next one, a pec, right? these pecs are basically rendered exactly like spheres. Okay, so you've got the highlight, right? You've got the main point of light, then you've got the active highlight, then you go into a halftone, which, because of the different lighting structures I have, I've actually gone from the green light into a halftone of warm light that's kind of coming in from the fire, into a cool core shadow that fades into this blue-purple cool ambient light. And that's basically all three of my lights affecting one sphere. And that's what his pecs basically are, if you look at them. You know, especially this one on the right that gets more into the fire. You have that really cool shadow, transitions into a warm halftone, and then into getting hit by the light from this local light, this orb thing on his necklace. Also, you can see that how much this local light is affecting his face. He's underlit, and I wanted to underlight him because underlighting is so moody and kind of creepy, you know, right? So underlit his chin, underlit his nose, underlit in his brow. All of the things that you would normally think to put in the heaviest shadow are actually getting the heaviest light. We're also accentuating the idea of his cheekbones and his sunken in kind of face by putting these bright spots right on his underside of his cheekbone. That's telling us that there's a plane change. Every time we see value change, we see plane change. His claw up here, let's look at one more of the shapes, the forms from our first diagram. Let me turn the tiling off real quick. Up here, right here, you can see that his claw is basically a cone, and it's the way that it's rendered. So if we turn this off, it's, you know, the idea of that quick core shadow, grabbing light from, and again, I've accentuated the idea of how light is affecting this for the sake of the graphic appeal. But for all intents and purposes, it's rendered like a cone. That is the basic idea. And so, lastly, all this color can be really distracting. And so one thing that's really important is to understand, are you being visually descriptive in value alone? And so I've set up a quick layer mode here, or an adjustment layer. Set it to gray. So now we can look, taking all of the color out, are we still making the same statement? Well, I think basically yes, we are. We still see all of the same shapes, all the same forms, I should say, really, are being described. And that is absolutely vital as you get into color and you go, okay, I want warm light, I want cool light. All of those lights that you're choosing, the colors you're choosing, still need to be described as values first. So if the value is wrong, it doesn't matter if the color feels right, the value has to be right as well. In fact, that value is what turns form. Color doesn't really turn form. So I really encourage you to think about, to learn in gray, to do some renderings in gray, just in value, black and white kind of a thing, and just think about the power that value has on your perception of form. And then you can start to indulge yourself in all of the color and those kinds of great things. So anyways, hopefully this has been a good lesson for you understanding why this boring stuff. I know when I was a young artist, I just didn't see how that equals this. It just didn't translate for me. I was like, I'm not drawing a bunch of cylinders and spheres. I want to draw cool characters. But all of the way that these are rendered is the way in which you render all forms. So learn how to render these forms, understand how light is behaving with the surfaces around it, and then take that knowledge and you'll have a really great time doing whatever it is you want to do. Alright, so that's going to wrap this one up. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications of future videos, and I will see you guys in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, share it with your friends, ring the bell for notifications of future videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.